The campaign that produced the fighting in Ormoc Bay began with the decision to re-enter the central Philippines in October 1944. After operations in the Marianas and the Palau area shifted the strategic balance in the Western Pacific, American planners judged that cutting Japan off from oil and raw materials moving from the Netherlands' East Indies through the South China Sea would be decisive. The Philippine archipelago lay across those sea lanes. Leyte, positioned at the junction of the Visayan passages, offered anchorages on both coasts and interior roads suitable for moving corps-sized forces. On 20th October 1944, the United States Sixth Army under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger landed X Corps, 1st Cavalry Division, 24th Infantry Division, on the northeastern coast near Tacloban, and 24th Corps, 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions near Dulag, with additional divisions, 77th and 32nd, scheduled to follow. Amphibious shipping and fire support came from 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, while carrier aviation from 3rd Fleet under Admiral William Halsey covered the wider theater. By D+4, the beachheads had linked, and U.S. air units began moving to Tacloban and Dulag airfields to shorten reaction times. Japanese grand strategy in late 1944 hinged on inflicting major losses in a concentrated fleet action and then reinforcing the decisive land battle. The combined fleet and land-based air groups responded to the Leyte landings with the operation that produced the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 23rd to 26th October 1944. Although Japanese surface forces reached the vicinity of the transports in San Pedro Bay, losses in battleships, carriers, cruisers, and trained aviators reduced their ability to contest sea control around Leyte in daylight. That outcome did not end the campaign. Headquarters, 14th Area Army on Luzon, and the newly formed 35th Army in the southern Philippines, commanded by Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, were ordered to concentrate on Leyte and defeat the U.S. 6th Army ashore. The main port available to deliver reinforcements to western Leyte was Ormoc, on a bay open to the Camotes Sea and sheltered by mountain ridges that limited east-west movement. The road from Ormoc north through the valley to Carigara and south toward Bay became the logistical axis for both sides. From early November, Japanese staff work focused on moving major formations from Luzon to Ormoc, despite the loss of air superiority. The reinforcement series was organized as TA convoys, TA-1 onward, each combining transports with destroyers and smaller escorts drawn from remaining fleet units. The troop lists included elements of the 1st Division and 26th Division, the 68th Independent Mixed Brigade, service troops, and munitions detachments. On paper, a full division numbered 15,000 to 20,000 personnel. In practice, shipping limits and attrition meant battalion and regimental-sized echelons embarked separately. The naval commander tasked with convoy cover had to accept night transits, coastal hugging, and dispersal at dawn to reduce vulnerability to U.S. airstrikes. Fuel scarcity in the Philippines and the wider empire constrained sortie rates. Ships often sailed with mixed cargoes of troops, artillery, rations, and ammunition in holds not designed for rapid discharge at underdeveloped piers. American operational aims after the landings shifted from expanding the beachhead to interdicting the western coast of Leyte, because ground contact reports indicated that significant Japanese units were entering the valley through Ormoc. Interdiction combined several arms. 5th Air Force and 13th Air Force, operating B-25s, A-20s, P-38s, and later P-47s from New Guinea, and then Leyte fields, targeted shipping lanes in the Camotes Sea and anchorages at Ormoc, Palampon, and nearby coves. 7th Fleet destroyers and destroyer escorts were tasked to penetrate the bay at night, to attack unloading points, and to counter Japanese destroyers attempting high-speed runs. PT boat squadrons established forward bases to screen the western approaches and report convoy movements. Submarines on patrol lines between Luzon and Leyte added a further layer of attrition. The intent was cumulative, to force Japanese echelons to arrive piecemeal under anti-ship and anti-air pressure, and thus reduce their combat power upon entry. Terrain, weather, and infrastructure shaped all subsequent engagements. Mountain ranges bisecting Leyte limited cross-island movement to a few roads cut through passes. The Ormoc Valley floor allowed trucks and artillery to move in column, but bridges and culverts were vulnerable to demolition or air attack. Port facilities at Ormoc consisted of a modest pier and lighters. Under air threat, unloading occurred at night, often by barge to small beaches. November brought monsoon conditions with low ceilings and frequent squalls. For Japanese commanders, poor weather created windows in which convoys might slip past daytime air patrols. For American air units, wet runways and cloud layers complicated bombing and skip bombing profiles, but did not eliminate sortie generation. Both sides recorded that storms at sea occasionally dispersed formations, delayed rendezvous, and increased non-combat losses. Intelligence on convoy movements and ground reinforcement was uneven. U.S. naval radio intelligence and aerial reconnaissance from long-range search squadrons detected departures from Manila and the Bicol coast, yet cloud cover and the number of possible routes produced gaps. PT boats relied on visual sightings and occasional Coast Watcher reports. On the Japanese side, Army headquarters on Leyte received fragmentary air reconnaissance from surviving aircraft based on Luzon and Samar, and relied on convoy commanders' signals that were kept brief to minimize interception. This uncertainty led both commands to hedge. American destroyer groups were vectored repeatedly into Ormoc Bay on different nights to exploit any contact, while Japanese staff scheduled successive TA convoys to preserve tempo, even if one echelon suffered losses. Civilian considerations added another layer. Pre-war Ormoc and the valley towns supported agriculture and coastal trade. By November 1944, residents faced requisitioning by both armies, displacement from air attack zones, and the breakdown of inter-island transport that had supplied rice, salt, and kerosene. Filipino guerrilla organizations in western Leyte gathered information on road traffic and unloading, but their communications with U.S. commands were limited by equipment and the hazards of crossing front lines. Japanese military police investigated suspected leaks near the wharves, while U.S. planners weighed the effect of bombing near populated areas against the urgency of stopping reinforcements. These civilian pressures did not determine tactics inside the bay, but they affected the availability of labor, guides, and local craft that both sides used during night movements. By the end of the first week of November, the campaign structure was defined. U.S. ground forces aimed to break Japanese defenses along the valley corridor by converging from the east and the south, while cutting the Ormoc lifeline from the sea. Japanese higher command aimed to deliver enough combat power through Ormoc to restore a continuous front and delay the U.S. advance until additional formations could be ferried from Luzon. The contest would concentrate along the 40-kilometer stretch of water and shoreline that made up Ormoc Bay, where destroyers, transports, PT boats, and aircraft would contest every night and every weather window. The figures that mattered were now rates and intervals. How many troops and tons per convoy could be landed under fire? How many sorties per day could the Leyte airfield sustain in monsoon conditions? How many destroyers on either side remained operational with adequate fuel? The answers to those quantitative problems set the conditions for the first night clashes inside the bay that followed. The opening moves inside the bay began once both commands accepted that reinforcement by sea would continue despite air losses. In the first days of November 1944, Japanese staff on Luzon assembled the next convoy echelons with the aim of moving infantry regiments and service troops directly into Ormoc during periods of low ceiling and rain. Destroyers assigned as fast transports took on mixed loads, rifle companies on deck, ammunition and rations in holds, light artillery lashed for quick discharge. Smaller cargo vessels carried trucks, radio sets, and engineer stores. Sailing tables placed departures after sunset from Manila and the Bicol ports, with planned landfalls off western Leyte before dawn, 2 nights later, assuming weather held and no force speed reductions occurred. On arrival, the destroyers would enter the bay, make the pier or designated beaches in column, and unload by parties rehearsed to move in darkness with limited signals. American movements in the same period aimed to compress the reaction time between convoy sighting and interdiction, As Tacloban Airfield became fully operational, fighter and light bomber units shifted from New Guinea staging bases to Leyte itself. That change cut transit time to the Camotes Sea from hours to minutes and allowed repeated attacks within the same daylight window. Patrol lines of PT boats extended along the western approaches, using temporary bases established along the Leyte coast. 7th Fleet destroyers, organized in rotating groups to offset maintenance and fuel constraints, were assigned night entries into Ormoc Bay when reconnaissance suggested unloading in progress. Command arrangements clarified. Shore-based air under 5th and 13th Air Forces retained tasking authority for daylight shipping strikes, while 7th Fleet controlled surface actions and PT operations. Requests from 6th Army for interdiction of specific road nodes near Ormoc were integrated into daily target lists when aircraft availability permitted. The first convoy cycle to test these methods arrived during the second week of November. Low cloud shielded much of the route, but breaks near the mouth of the bay exposed ships to search aircraft operating from Leyte. That afternoon, mixed flights of medium bombers and fighters attacked from low altitude using skip bombing and strafing against vessels slowed by the navigation turn into the bay. Several transports were set afire, and unloading plans were curtailed to prevent secondary explosions at the wharf. Japanese destroyer commanders chose to clear the anchorage and land troops at alternate points down the coast, using barges and ships' boats after dark. Loss calculations on the Japanese side balanced the troops already ashore against the risk to remaining convoy assets. Subsequent signals ordered the next echelon to stage through smaller coves before entering Ormoc proper. Night surface probes followed. On 2 successive nights, U.S. destroyer groups entered the bay at high speed in narrow column, using radar to sort returns from shoreline clutter and to identify targets near the pier. Illumination rounds were withheld to preserve surprise. Fire was opened at short range once silhouette and range rate indicated a ship underway or clustered barges alongside. In several cases, coastal batteries responded with harassing fire from positions on headlands, and destroyers withdrew on pre-briefed tracks to limit exposure to torpedoes. The effect on unloading was disruptive rather than decisive. Japanese troops already landed dispersed into nearby tree lines, while barges hugged the coast until the intruders cleared. Both commands noted that monsoon squalls could erase radar contacts and muffle gunfire, creating brief pauses in which unloading resumed. Aviation adjusted quickly. Ground crews at Leyte Fields laid Marsden mat to extend runway length, improving launch reliability in rain. Fighter-bomber formations shifted to armed reconnaissance patterns that gave patrol coverage over the bay during hours when convoy commanders preferred to arrive. For Japanese escort air, surviving units on Luzon attempted limited daylight fighter sweeps over the northern Visayas, but distance and fuel limits reduced time on station. As a result, convoy protection increasingly depended on timing and smoke rather than air cover. To reduce exposure, convoy planners issued instructions to cut unloading cycles to the essential, priority to rifle ammunition, mortar bombs, and medical packs. Delay heavy cargo if aerial attack was likely within the hour. Engineer detachments ashore improved beach exits so that loads moved off sand quickly to the road. The ground situation shaped the urgency. Reports from Japanese Army units fighting near the northern end of the valley stated that battalions were holding road junctions, but required immediate reinforcement to prevent a breach toward Ormoc. This produced orders to accept higher shipping risks to land infantry companies even if vehicles and heavier weapons arrived later. On the American side, Corps headquarters directing the advance westward requested increased strikes on bridges and culverts south of Ormoc to slow movement from the docks to the front. This targeting required periods of clear weather. When the ceiling lifted, medium bombers attacked with delayed fuses to collapse spans. Pilots reported secondary explosions consistent with ammunition trucks caught on approaches. The opening phase also brought the first sustained use of explosive-laden crash attacks against ships off the western shore of Leyte. Single-engine aircraft diving at low altitude, targeted transports, and older destroyers engaged in screening or cargo discharge near advanced bases south of the bay. On one morning in late November, a destroyer transport operating in the sector was struck and set ablaze. with the loss forcing nearby ships to maneuver out to sea and pause shore movements. Japanese records framed these attacks as a supplement to convoy efforts, intended to reduce U.S. surface presence at the very hours convoys aimed to run in. U.S. commanders responded by widening picket lines and increasing fighter cover during early morning and late afternoon periods when the threat was highest. Communications discipline became a factor. U.S. intercept stations recorded short, irregular signals on routes leading into the bay, but often could not convert them into timely warnings. To compensate, patrol aircraft were assigned to specific time blocks regardless of intercepts, accepting fuel costs to maintain a visible threat over the approaches. Japanese naval officers limited transmissions to brief position reports at designated waypoints and used prearranged light signals once within the bay to coordinate pier approaches in blackout conditions. This reduced interception risk, but increased the chance of navigational error under rainstorms, and one cargo vessel grounded on an unlit shoal while attempting to reach an alternate landing point. By the close of November, measured results on both sides indicated that the opening moves had not resolved the contest. Japanese echelons had landed thousands of troops, distributed over multiple nights, into the Ormoc area, but losses in transports, barges, and cargo delayed the arrival of artillery pieces and vehicles. American forces had degraded unloading cycles and reduced the flow rate, yet they had not completely closed the bay. Casualty lists reflected the pattern. Ship crews and embarked troops hit during air attacks in daylight. Destroyer and PT boat crews in night skirmishes. Dock workers and local civilians injured when fires spread from ships to adjacent structures on the waterfront. Both commands recalibrated. Japanese staff scheduled additional convoys with heavier destroyer screens and greater reliance on dispersion among small beaches. U.S. surface commanders prepared to send fresh destroyer divisions directly into the bay to intercept enemy destroyers rather than strike only cargo craft. The next engagements would test whether concentrated night action could change the arithmetic that the first month of operations had only bent. Strategic objectives on both sides crystallized as November advanced, and convoy results showed that neither interdiction nor reinforcement alone would settle the campaign. Japanese higher command framed Leyte as the immediate decisive theater and set a measurable target: deliver enough combat power through Ormoc to reconstitute a continuous front, counterattack toward the northeast, and disrupt U.S. logistics on the eastern plain. Staff estimates on Luzon and in the southern Philippines proposed a phased buildup. Initially battalion echelons from the 1st Division and 26th Division, followed by regimental headquarters and artillery groups from Luzon depots, moving by destroyer and coastal transport under the series of TA convoys. The intended end state was a force on Leyte approximating 2 reinforced divisions, with attached service troops, roughly 30,000 to 35,000 personnel, positioned along the Ormoc-Carigara Road and the ridgelines east of it. Concurrently, Navy planners sought to retain enough destroyers to screen each echelon, accepting that transports and barges would absorb the greater share of losses. American planning defined success as the collapse of that reinforcement pipeline. 6th Army directed a converging ground advance to compress the Ormoc Valley, while 5th and 13th Air Forces, 7th Fleet Surface Forces, and PT squadrons imposed attrition at sea. The logistics metric was explicit: reduce arrivals at Ormoc to a rate insufficient to replace daily frontline losses in infantry strength and ammunition expenditure. Air staffs built daily target lists for shipping, road nodes, and storage areas west of the Central Divide. Naval staff scheduled destroyer sweeps into the bay and patrol boxes for PT boats. Submarines maintained barrier patrols north of the Comodes Sea. A contingency amphibious move onto the west coast, landing a division to sever the road near Ormoc itself, was retained as an option once airfields on Leyte generated sustained sorties and shipping became available. Doctrinal preferences and material limits shaped the plans. Japanese convoy doctrine, developed under pressure since the New Guinea campaigns, emphasized night movement, coastal hugging, smoke, and dispersion among small beaches when primary piers were threatened. Destroyers acting as fast transports had rehearsed unloading parties for rifle ammunition, mortar bombs, and medical supplies that could be manhandled across barges. Artillery and vehicles, by contrast, required time at a pier or calm water ship-to-shore transfer. Escorting destroyers, many veteran units, carried limited fuel and torpedoes and were now tasked more often with transport than with offensive surface action. Air cover from Luzon fighter groups could not provide continuous protection over Ormoc. Therefore, convoy timing sought windows of poor weather and short dawn approaches. American interdiction doctrine mixed radar-directed night surface action with daylight-armed reconnaissance. Destroyer divisions trained to enter restricted waters at high speed, using SG radar to sort contacts and illuminate with starshell only at the point of engagement. PT boats established picket lines and shadowed targets, reporting by voice and clear when brevity could yield a destroyer intercept within minutes. Medium bombers flew low-altitude skip bombing and mast-height runs against ships maneuvering near the bay entrance, while fighter bombers struck barges, road columns, and dumps immediately behind the beaches. The expansion of Marsden-matted runways on the East Coast allowed more sorties in marginal weather and reduced turnaround time, an important parameter when convoys gambled on brief lulls. Supply systems on both sides imposed hard constraints. Japanese staffs calculated lift by hull count and cycle time. A destroyer or small transport could carry several hundred troops and several dozen tons of cargo. Round trips from Manila to Ormoc consumed days and fuel stocks that were not easily replaced. Ammunition requirements for 2 divisions in defensive and counterattack roles exceeded what could be landed if unloading was repeatedly interrupted. Therefore, priority lists elevated small arms ammunition, 50 to 81 mm mortar rounds, and medical packs, with 75 to 105 mm artillery ammunition and radio batteries next. U.S. planners, conversely, tracked daily sortie capacity from Leyte fields and the availability of destroyers after prior surface actions and kamikaze damage in the wider archipelago. Bridges and culverts on the Ormoc Road were targeted not only to delay movement, but to create predictable choke points for subsequent strikes, tying air planning to engineer reconnaissance. Intelligence inputs, though incomplete, were integrated into the planning cycles. U.S. radio intelligence detected some convoy departures from Luzon, but often lacked precise timing at the bay entrance, forcing commanders to plan nightly destroyer penetrations, even without firm contact. Coast watchers and Filipino guerrilla reports from the western shore identified unloading sites and traffic peaks, contributing to the daily strike matrix. Japanese staffs relied on short convoy signals, limited air reconnaissance, and reports from Lady Army units on ammunition states and casualty rates to argue for increased convoy tempo even when shipping losses rose. Both sides acknowledged that monsoon weather degraded reconnaissance reliability and thus widened planning margins. Miscalculations were embedded in the assumptions. Japanese planners accepted that piecemeal arrivals could still aggregate into a counter-offensive force if convoy rhythm held. This underestimated the cumulative effect of repeated air and surface disruptions on heavy weapon landings and on service troops needed to keep units supplied. American planners initially believed that enhanced sortie rates from Leyte alone might close the bay. Experience in the first weeks showed that weather gaps and night runs kept a significant flow moving, prompting consideration of the West Coast amphibious option earlier than preferred. Both sides also adjusted expectations regarding the impact of special attack aircraft. Japanese directives treated these as a means to reduce U.S. surface coverage at critical hours, while U.S. naval planning shifted picket dispositions and combat air patrol timing rather than expecting a permanent deterrent effect. Propaganda and public communications diverged from operational detail, but still influenced planning tempo. Japanese statements to troops on Leyte emphasized that reinforcements were arriving continuously, and that the strategic goal was the destruction of enemy forces on the island. This messaging supported orders to maintain forward positions, even when ammunition states dropped. American communiques framed the air-sea interdiction as steadily reducing enemy capacity to fight, reinforcing the priority assigned to shipping strikes, and the narrative that the Central Philippine sea lanes were being cut. Neither side publicized the extent of civilian displacement in the Ormoc Valley, but both noted that labor and local craft use around beaches affected unloading and concealment. Plans incorporated measures to control waterfront areas and to move cargo inland rapidly to avoid secondary explosions in populated zones. By late November, the planning horizon shortened to weekly cycles. Japanese headquarters scheduled successive TA echelons, with heavier destroyer screens and specific alternate landing points south and north of Ormoc to divide U.S. response. Shore parties prepared additional beach exits and concealed dumps within marching distance of road nodes. U.S. command synchronized 3 levers, daily air attacks on ships and road targets, repeated night destroyer entries into the bay, keyed to likely arrival windows, and the assembly of an amphibious group to project infantry directly onto the west coast to sever the Ormoc Road. Each plan sought to convert incremental advantages in timing, weather exploitation, and radar or shoreline knowledge into quantitative outcomes. Fewer tons landed per convoy, fewer vehicles reaching the front, more bridges down per clear weather day. These metrics would frame the next phase when the first large night surface battles inside the bay tested whether concentrated action could compress the reinforcement rate below the threshold needed to sustain Japanese operations on Leyte. The first sustained clashes around Ormoc Bay began with the TA-3 and TA-4 reinforcement echelons, whose staggered departures from Manila on August 9–November 1944 were intended to recycle the same destroyer escorts between successive convoys. U.S. land-based reconnaissance fixed their approach routes on November 9th to 10th, and the 38th Bomb Group struck TA-4 near Ponson Island on November 10th, with 32 B-25s under P-47 escort, employing minimum altitude runs and skip bombing. Takatsu Maru and Keishi Maru were sunk, a third transport was disabled, and 2 small escorts were lost. The group reported 7 B-25s down. Despite shipping losses, Japanese reports noted that approximately 10,000 troops had already been put ashore from the combined early convoys, though with reduced heavy equipment and supplies. The next day, carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 hit shipping streams feeding Ormoc, sinking destroyers and transports, including Shimakaze and several Maru, and killing Rear Admiral Mikio Hayakawa with his ship. These first blows demonstrated a pattern. Troops might land in significant numbers, but tonnage for artillery, vehicles, and ammunition would be contested at every stage between Luzon and the Ormoc wharves. Late November, weather closed ceilings and scattered squalls across the Camotes Sea, degrading daily air interdiction and forcing a shift toward night surface action. 7th Fleet swept Canigao Channel for mines and on November 27th to 28th sent Destroyer Squadron 22 into Ormoc Bay to shell docking areas. When a patrol plane reported a surfaced submarine south of Pasajan Island, the division maneuvered to intercept. At 1:27 on 28th November, radar contact developed into gunfire that disabled Japanese submarine, its I-46, which sank at 1:45 after attempting to reply with deck guns. The following night, a repeat sweep found only barges and small craft, emphasizing how quickly unloading parties dispersed along the shoreline when larger escorts withdrew. For Japanese convoy staff, the weather that hindered U.S. air also created approach windows. For U.S. surface forces, radar and pre-briefed tracks now governed night tactics inside restricted waters. Small echelons attempted to exploit those weather gaps. TA-6 departed Manila on 27th November with 2 transports and 3 small escorts, aiming for direct discharge at Ormoc. PT boat lines met the formation as it entered the bay on November 28th. Surviving ships then faced air attack while retiring. All 5 vessels were eventually lost, though Japanese logs recorded that most of the intended supplies were passed over the side or barged ashore before the final strikes. The increasing reliance on barges and ships' boats reflected a calculated trade, higher attrition among unarmored small craft in return for shorter pier times and less predictable landing points south and north of the main wharf. U.S. patrols noted more traffic at minor beaches and recommended adding those coves to daylight strike lists when weather allowed. The first major destroyer-on-destroyer engagement inside the bay followed the arrival of TA-7, On December 1st, 3 transports sailed from Manila, escorted by destroyers Take and Kuwa, with auxiliary transport submarines tasked to move cargo and personnel in parallel. Unloading began at Ormoc shortly before midnight on the 2nd of December. At 00:09 on 3 December, U.S. Destroyer Division 120, Allen M. Sumner, Moale, and Cooper entered the bay at high speed. Star shells were withheld initially. Radar bearings and range rates guided opening salvos on ships clustered near the pier. The U.S. division sank transports at the wharf and fought into heavy cross threats. Yokosuka, P-1Y, Francis bombers diving through breaks in the cloud deck, coastal batteries firing from headlands, and torpedo tracks from enemy destroyers. Kuwa was sunk and her commander, Lieutenant Commander Masamichi Yamashita, was killed. Take scored with torpedoes against Cooper, which sank at about 00:15 with 191 fatalities, before PBY Catalinas rescued 168 survivors later on, 4 December. At 00:33, with ammunition expenditure high and multiple threat vectors unresolved, the 2 surviving U.S. destroyers were ordered out of the bay. Japanese convoy records counted the resupply as accomplished under fire. U.S. logs emphasize the complexity of the engagement, which combined surface gunnery, torpedoes, air attack, shore guns, and mines in a confined anchorage. Air-sea pressure resumed almost immediately. On December 7th, the U.S. 77th Infantry Division conducted an amphibious landing at Albuera, approximately 5 to 6 kilometers south of Ormoc, to impose a direct cut on the coastal road. The landings met little organized fire from shore, but covering destroyers were struck by crash attacks during the day, with losses that forced temporary adjustments to screening dispositions and slowed offshore logistics. In response, Japanese TA-8 diverted some 4,000 troops to San Isidro, about 30 miles north of Ormoc, to avoid the newly established U.S. ground lodgment on the west coast. Air attacks that same day sank all 5 TA-8 transports and damaged destroyer escorts Umoy and Sugi, imposing further costs on the already limited convoy pool. The combination of a new U.S. infantry presence on the bay and persistent air interdiction now made single-pier discharge in Ormoc increasingly hazardous even at night. Throughout these first engagements, the arithmetic of reinforcement and interdiction remained close. Japanese commands succeeded in landing thousands of infantry from multiple divisions, often at the price of transports and barges and with heavy equipment relegated to later echelons. U.S. air and surface forces sank or disabled a growing list of hulls and occasionally destroyed loads already moved ashore when stockpiles were discovered near road nodes, yet the weather and night tactics prevented a complete closure of the bay. The initial month's toll on both warships and auxiliaries forced each side to adjust. Japan concentrated remaining destroyers to screen fewer but more heavily protected echelons and increased dispersion to secondary beaches. The United States integrated patrol torpedo boats, destroyers, and land-based air more tightly around forecast convoy windows, and accelerated preparation for sustained operations by the 77th Infantry Division along the west coast. These adaptations set the conditions for the December clashes that would determine whether Ormoc remained a functioning port or became a series of contested shorelines and wreck sites. Escalation in early December followed from 2 converging pressures. Japanese headquarters on Luzon maintained the TA convoy rhythm to feed the Ormoc lifeline, and U.S. commands increased simultaneous use of air, surface, and ground levers to compress that lifeline from multiple directions. The result was a week of continuous engagements in which ships, airfields, road nodes, and newly seized shore positions were contested in overlapping cycles rather than in isolated actions. Weather remained a central variable. Successive squalls over the Comote Sea degraded reconnaissance and bombing accuracy by day, while heavy rain complicated night radar returns inside the bay. Both sides accepted higher risk to preserve tempo, bringing more units into contact at shorter intervals than in November. On the Japanese side, the immediate objective was to push additional infantry and ammunition into the Ormoc Valley to stabilize road junctions north and south of the town. Staff scheduled new echelons with destroyer screens and auxiliary craft aiming to land regimental elements in two-night sequences. First night for rifle companies and small arms ammunition, second night for mortars, radios, and medical packs, with artillery and vehicles to follow if pier time allowed. Convoy strength per echelon was typically in the low thousands of personnel with several hundred tons of cargo, divided among transports and fast transports. Shore parties expanded the number of minor beaches used for discharge to dilute U.S. attention on the central pier. Fuel shortages forced careful routing and limited destroyer sprint speeds, which widened exposure windows at the approaches to the bay. U.S. forces escalated along three axes. First, land-based air increased armed reconnaissance sweeps that combined anti-shipping strikes with attacks on bridges and culverts along the Ormoc Road. Target lists placed priority on spans whose destruction would trap vehicles unloaded the previous night, producing secondary explosions from ammunition trucks and reducing forward distribution. Second, destroyer divisions were tasked to re-enter the bay on successive nights using alternating approach tracks to avoid predictable patterns. Radar plots were cross-checked with PT boat shadowing reports, and Starshell was reserved for moments when contact solutions were firm enough to risk illumination without opening ships to shore battery registration. Third, with a beachhead established south of Ormoc, U.S. ground units began moving up the coastal road to interdict traffic moving out of the port area and to seize firing positions covering the waterfront. Casualties and material losses mounted in this phase, and they reflected the distinct threats faced by each side. Japanese records for early December show increased losses among transport crews and barge handlers during daylight, when aircraft found ships maneuvering near the bay entrance or cargo stacks near road nodes. Losses among destroyer crews rose during night actions inside the bay, when U.S. divisions engaged at short range and when torpedo attacks intersected withdrawal tracks. Army units ashore reported rising numbers of wounded from air bursts over road columns and from fragmentation during pier area fires. On the U.S. side, destroyers and smaller escorts sustained damage and crew casualties from low-altitude crash attacks in daylight while screening landing areas on the west coast, and from shore battery fire and near misses inside the bay. Air units recorded aircraft and crew losses to weather, light anti-aircraft fire clustered around the pier, and operational accidents on wet runways. Command challenges intensified as the pace quickened. Japanese convoy commanders reported that blackout operations in rain increased navigational errors, and at least one cargo vessel went aground while diverting to an alternate landing point. Signals discipline, short, infrequent transmissions, protected convoys from interception, but constrained the ability to request immediate destroyer support when PT boats harassed barges near minor beaches. Army headquarters on Leyte pressed for ammunition deliveries to named battalions with 24 to 48-hour urgency, forcing rescheduling when transports were sunk or damaged. On the U.S. side, destroyer captains navigating confined waters weighed the risk of mines and torpedo salvos against the imperative to disrupt unloading. Several sweeps terminated earlier than planned when simultaneous air warnings and shore gun reports complicated firing solutions. Air commanders had to reallocate sorties between shipping strikes and close air support for ground operations advancing toward the town, especially when weather compressed flying windows to a few hours. Terrain and infrastructure multiplied the effects of each engagement. The Ormoc Pier could accelerate heavy cargo discharge, but its visibility and limited berthing made it a predictable target. Damage from fires and near misses forced more reliance on barges and ships' boats, slowing throughput and increasing exposure time along open beaches. Inland, the Valley Road Net's few bridges became recurring objectives. When spans dropped, Japanese engineer units used timber bypasses and fords to restore traffic. But these fixes lowered load capacity and raised breakdown rates for vehicles carrying artillery ammunition. U.S. engineers on the West Coast improved beach exits and laid corduroy across soft ground to move their own supplies forward, maintaining pressure on a timetable that depended on keeping destroyer screens intact under air attack. Morale fluctuated under these conditions. Japanese infantry arriving at dispersed beaches entered a front where units were already rationing small arms ammunition and mortar rounds. Orders emphasized holding road junctions and counterattacking when local superiority could be achieved. Reports from company-grade officers describe long night marches from landing sites to assembly areas, with casualties during movement from stray rounds and air-delivered fragmentation. U.S. infantry advancing up the coast recorded rapid gains when weather-grounded enemy aircraft, followed by pauses to reorganize when destroyer cover had to retire offshore after daylight attacks. Naval crews on both sides operated at sustained alert states, with gunnery and damage control teams rotating under shortened rest cycles as warnings repeated through day and night. International political response in this period did not alter the operational pattern, but strategic communications framed expectations. Japanese broadcasts asserted that reinforcement of Leyte continued and that enemy shipping suffered under special attack operations in the central Philippines. U.S. communiques highlighted the advance of ground forces on the west coast and the cumulative attrition of shipping attempting to reach Ormoc. These narratives supported command directives: maintain convoy tempo despite losses on one side, intensify interdiction until flow dropped below replacement needs on the other. Neither public message addressed civilian displacement along the bay, although both commands recorded that port workers and local boatmen were increasingly scarce as bombardment spread fires through waterfront districts, and as requisitions of food and materials grew. By mid-December's first week, the crisis point was visible in daily tallies. Japanese staffs counted troop arrivals that met some infantry replacement goals, but fell short in artillery, vehicles, and radio batteries. Destroyer availability for convoy cover declined as battle damage and fuel consumption accumulated. American staffs noted increased ship and aircraft losses from crash attacks during coastal operations, even as ground units reported that pressure on the road south of Ormoc was constricting movement. Both sides prepared for concentrated efforts. Japan to push another echelon under heavier destroyer screen into the bay, and the United States to combine a direct assault on Ormoc with renewed night surface action intended to break up any convoy attempting to land under cover of weather. The next phase would test whether compressed timelines and reinforced screens could reverse the trend lines established since late November, or whether the cumulative constraints now in place would determine the outcome ashore and afloat. The campaign reached its peak between 7th and 11th December 1944, when sea, air, and ground actions converged around the bay and the coastal road. On December 7th, U.S. forces executed a deliberate West Coast expansion to compress the Ormoc corridor. Elements of the 77th Infantry Division, with the 305th and 307th Infantry Regiments in lead roles and attached engineers and artillery, staged from positions south of Albuera and pushed north on the coastal track. Destroyers and LCI gunboats provided daylight covering fire, but operated under repeated crash attacks by single-engine aircraft, approaching at low altitude from the direction of Cebu and western Leyte. In the same sector that morning, a former four-stack destroyer, converted to an auxiliary gunboat, was set aflame by a diving aircraft and subsequently scuttled after crew evacuation. The loss reduced immediate gunfire support and forced a temporary widening of offshore screen distances while damaged ships cleared the area. Logistics tempo rose on both sides. U.S. shore parties improved the Albuera beachhead with additional causeways and pontoon barges, enabling trucks to move supplies forward despite rain-softened ground. Forward observers registered firing data for 105mm and 155mm batteries covering the Ormoc waterfront and choke points on the road north of the town. Japanese engineer and service troops worked in reverse, cutting new beach exits near minor coves south of the pier and erecting camouflage over dumps within march distance of the highway. Shore patrols attempted to control small craft and restrict civilian presence near unloading points after several fires had spread through waterfront structures in earlier attacks. On December 9th, weather breaks allowed sustained armed reconnaissance over the Comotes Sea. Medium bombers and fighter bombers struck cargo concentrations south of the pier, while separate formations targeted bridges at the approaches to Ormoc. Several spans collapsed, forcing bypasses that limited axle loads for trucks carrying artillery ammunition. Japanese convoy planners nevertheless ordered the next echelon to run for the bay under night cover. Destroyers acting as fast transports embarked rifle companies, mortar sections, and radio teams with priority over heavier loads. Cargo ships carried mixed ammunition and rations, but their approach depended on finding a berthing spot at the pier or calm water anchorages suitable for barges. Signals discipline kept transmissions short. Landfall was set for the first hours after midnight on the 10th of December. Ground pressure reached the town itself on December 10th. After artillery registration, U.S. battalions advanced along the coastal road and on lateral tracks that entered Ormoc from the south and southeast. Opposition consisted of rear guards supported by machine guns and mortars positioned to delay rather than hold. By midday, U.S. troops reported possession of the pier area and adjacent blocks. Engineers began clearance of obstacles and unexploded ordnance while infantry patrols moved to the northern outskirts to block withdrawal routes. Seizure of the town altered the tactical map, but did not end the maritime contest. Japanese staff immediately redirected landing plans to beaches north of Ormoc and to the road hub at Palompon to sustain the valley defense. For U.S. commanders, the capture opened observation on the harbor and simplified artillery targeting of shoreline movements, but it also exposed the waterfront to counterfire and air attack while clearances continued. The maritime climax followed on the night of 10th to 11th December, when a Japanese reinforcement echelon approached under monsoon cloud with a destroyer screen and multiple transports. PT pickets sighted silhouettes near the bay entrance shortly after midnight and reported course and speed. A U.S. destroyer group, vectored from offshore patrol lines, entered the bay in column, using radar to discriminate targets among shoreline returns. Fire was opened once range rates stabilized, with initial salvos directed at ships clustered near the waterfront and at moving contacts judged to be escorts. Torpedoes were launched by both sides. In the confined water, splinter and blast effects added to confusion as barges broke away and shore guns attempted ranging shots from headlands. One Japanese transport was set afire alongside. Another was disabled while retiring, and at least one escort sustained heavy damage during close-range exchanges. The U.S. group reported hits and near misses from air-delivered ordnance during egress when the ceiling briefly lifted. Withdrawal followed pre-brief tracks to avoid mine threat and to reduce exposure to torpedoes fired from multiple bearings. Daylight on the 11th of December extended the engagement. Armed reconnaissance located survivors, scattered barges, and fuel slicks near the southern coves. Attacks at mast height and with delayed fuse bombs ignited secondary fires among ammunition stacks ashore. Japanese records from units in the valley noted that several hundred reinforcements from the convoy reached assembly areas by foot after landing at dispersed points, but shortages in mortar and artillery ammunition persisted. Destroyer availability for further escort tasks tightened as battle damage, fuel consumption, and crew casualties accumulated. On the U.S. side, destroyers tasked to screen the West Coast lodgment sustained additional damage from low-altitude crash attacks that penetrated during early morning and late afternoon periods when combat air patrol coverage was in transition. Air units on Leyte continued to lose aircraft to weather and light anti-aircraft fire concentrated around the waterfront. Civilian effects at this peak were pronounced. The fires around the pier on December 10th to 11th spread to warehouses and adjacent dwellings. Evacuation from central Ormoc had already begun in previous weeks. The final clearance accelerated once artillery and airstrikes focused on the harbor precinct. Fishermen and small boat owners, previously drawn into military unloading under requisition, reduced activity after night shelling and daylight strafing along the shoreline. These changes affected both sides. Japanese shore parties had fewer local craft available for barge shuttles, and U.S. patrols received fewer ad hoc reports from inhabitants once movement into the town center became hazardous. Quantitatively, the balance during the peak phase showed mixed results. Japanese convoys succeeded in landing additional infantry companies and some specialist teams, despite losses to transports and barges. However, the ratio of personnel to heavy equipment skewed further toward rifle strength, as artillery pieces, vehicles, and large-caliber ammunition remained difficult to discharge under sustained pressure. U.S. forces achieved the occupation of Ormoc and inflicted losses on ships inside the bay and at the approaches, while continuing to absorb damage from crash attacks and shore batteries during coastal operations. Daily tonnage moved through the waterfront decreased relative to early November, but not to zero. The fight shifted from a single wharf to multiple small landing points north and west of the town. Command decisions during these days reflected the immediate arithmetic. Japanese headquarters ordered follow-on echelons to divert to points beyond direct observation from the captured pier, with instructions to break cargo into lighter loads suitable for rapid beach transfer. Army units were told to conserve artillery ammunition for counterattacks at selected road junctions, rather than for continuous harassing fire. U.S. commanders, noting the persistence of night entries despite the fall of the town, directed continued destroyer penetrations, keyed to expected arrival windows, coupled with daytime interdiction of the northern beaches and the Palampon Road. Engineers prioritized repairing and expanding positions around Ormoc to support artillery, restaging areas, and evacuation routes for wounded and civilians. By nightfall on the 11th of December, the peak had produced measurable shifts, but not a complete closure. The bay's central pier was no longer a reliable discharge point for Japanese convoys, yet the coastline to the north and the parallel road toward Palampon still offered intermittent access. The presence of U.S. infantry within the town allowed observation and artillery control over much of the harbor, while U.S. surface groups demonstrated the ability to reach the bay repeatedly at night. Japanese destroyer screens retained enough strength to escort additional echelons, but with reduced margins for damage and fuel. The next period would test whether dispersion to secondary beaches and reliance on overland redistribution could sustain the remaining Japanese formations in the valley, or whether converging ground pressure and continued interdiction would collapse the supply line beyond recovery. Resistance and adaptation defined the mid-December phase, as both commands sought to preserve operational aims under degraded conditions. Japanese army units in the valley reconfigured their defensive scheme from a continuous line into a network of strong points anchored on road junctions, creek lines, and village perimeters north of Ormoc. Company and battalion-sized groups dug mutually supporting positions with interlocking machine gun fields of fire, sighted mortars for registered defensive concentrations, and laid wire and mines to canalize the coastal advance. Limited stocks of 75 to 105 millimeter artillery ammunition were conserved for counterattacks or for interdiction of choke points where U.S. units would be exposed crossing culverts and cuttings. Infantry platoons emphasized night patrolling to disrupt engineering parties repairing the road, accepting attrition to slow the timetable. Seaborne reinforcement adapted in parallel, with the Ormoc Pier under observation. Convoy staff dispersed discharge points to coves north of the town and along the road toward Palampon. Destroyers acting as fast transports disembarked rifle companies by ships, boats, and barges. Small cargo vessels broke loads down to crates that could be moved by hand in the first minutes after beaching. Where surf permitted, landing points were shifted every night to reduce predictability. Shore parties pushed cargo inland by foot and handcart to pre-surveyed hides, reducing the density of exposed stacks that had drawn air attack. Transport submarines and small craft attempted limited deliveries of high-value items, radio batteries, medical stores, signal wire, whose volume-to-weight ratio made them suitable for covert runs. On land, Japanese commanders used relief in place in lateral shuttling to retain cohesion under pressure. Fresh companies from late echelons took over sections of the front, while veteran units concentrated for local counterattacks, timed to hit U.S. battalions as they reoriented after entering new terrain blocks. Counterattacks were typically platoon to company strength with mortar support, designed to inflict casualties and regain time rather than to recover large ground. Engineers improvised bypasses around destroyed bridges with timber trestles and fords, accepting reduced axle loads that constrained movement of artillery and heavy carts. Medical detachments established aid points under cover near road defiles, prioritizing evacuation on foot at night to conserve vehicles and fuel. U.S. forces adjusted methods to neutralize these adaptations. Along the west coast, infantry regiments advanced with engineer platoons forward, carrying bridging panels and fascines to cross culverts under observation. Artillery observers registered concentrations on likely counterattack routes, and pre-plotted targets at junctions and reverse slopes. Fire missions shifted from harassing interdiction to time barrages opening lanes for assaults through wire and mine belts. Radar-equipped destroyers refined night entry profiles into the bay. Approach speeds and courses were varied. Radar illumination was coordinated with PT boat shadowing, and patterns of starshell were altered to reduce predictability to shore batteries. Rocket-armed landing craft and gunboats provided point-blank fire against strongpoints at shoreline edges, reducing the need to commit infantry across open sand in daylight. Air-ground integration became more systematic, as runways on the East Coast dried between squalls. Fighter-bomber cab rank patterns enabled rapid calls on road targets and small beaches when reconnaissance or PT boats reported movement. Medium bombers employed delayed fuse bombs against bridge approaches to collapse spans without prolonged loiter over concentrated anti-aircraft positions. When cloud layers lowered ceilings, sorties shifted to armed reconnaissance over the Palompon Road, and to suppression of barge concentrations observed hugging the shoreline. The aim was less to annihilate a single convoy than to depress daily throughput, below what frontline Japanese battalions expended in small arms and mortar ammunition, creating cumulative shortages. Resource management on both sides shaped tempo. Japanese fuel allocations to escort destroyers were rationed to preserve future convoy capacity, which limited sprint speeds and time on station inside the bay. Ammunition issue at the front shifted toward small arms and 50 to 81 mm mortar rounds, with explicit orders to avoid expenditure outside planned counterattacks. U.S. staffs redistributed sorties between shipping strikes and close support to prevent ground operations from stalling during weather windows. Destroyer divisions rotated to maintain hulls with full magazines available for night penetrations. Engineer units on the U.S. side prioritized road repairs behind the leading battalions to keep artillery and supply echelons close enough to react to counterattacks within minutes rather than hours. Improvisation was visible at the tactical level. Japanese shore parties concealed beach exits with woven screens and fresh-cut vegetation. Sledges and bamboo poles were used to move ammunition in soaked fields where carts bogged. Signals personnel extended landline communications with salvage wire to reduce reliance on radios vulnerable to interception and in short supply. U.S. patrols used captured maps and local guides to trace footpaths that bypassed mined stretches of the highway. Small reconnaissance teams infiltrated to mark crossing points under cover of darkness, reducing daylight exposure when companies resumed movement. PT boats experimented with silent drift approaches to barge lanes, firing at silhouettes with automatic weapons to break up loading before withdrawing on pre-briefed bearings. The psychological load accumulated unevenly but measurably. Japanese infantry who had marched from dispersed landings into positions under constant artillery registration recorded fatigue from night movement and rationing. Orders to hold specific road nodes reinforced a defensive mindset even when counterattacks were planned. U.S. companies advancing sector by sector faced the friction of repeated halts for clearance of mines and booby traps, coupled with sudden close-range fire from concealed positions. The presence of artillery and naval gunfire support mitigated some stress but required strict control to prevent friendly fire in rain and limited visibility. Ship crews on both sides operated under compressed rest cycles as alerts for night surface action, dawn crash attacks, and daytime air searches overlapped. Adaptation also extended to medical and evacuation systems. Japanese aid stations shifted deeper into covered ravines, relying on stretcher chains at night to move wounded. Shortages in plasma and antibiotics increased the burden on surgical teams. U.S. units expanded beach evacuation near Albuera and forward casualty collection points along the coastal road, coordinating with artillery pauses and with destroyer movements to minimize exposure during loading. Weather-related delays forced both sides to stockpile in intermediate depots, which in turn attracted strikes when located. By the end of this phase, resilience had produced measurable though divergent effects. Japanese formations maintained a network of defensive localities north and west of Ormoc, sustained by dispersed landings and disciplined ammunition use, but Heavy weapon density and vehicle availability declined relative to early November. U.S. forces, integrating artillery, air, PT, and destroyer actions, narrowed the flow of supplies through the bay and advanced the ground line to positions overlooking key waterfront sectors and road exits, yet incurred continued ship and aircraft losses during daylight attacks and operational accidents in poor weather. Each side had learned to exploit transient advantages, cloud, darkness, shoreline cover, but the arithmetic of daily tonnage and ammunition expenditure increasingly favored the side with airfields on the island and an intact logistic base. The conditions were set for a geographic shift in focus toward the northern beaches and the Palampong corridor, where the next decisions would be forced. The turning point emerged between 10 and 15, December 1944, when the reinforcement pipeline through Ormoc could no longer keep pace with losses in ships, time, and delivered tonnage. The seizure of the town, on December 10th, removed the only developed pier from regular use and placed artillery observers within view of the waterfront. From that evening onward, Japanese echelons approaching the bay faced a layered problem. Night destroyer penetrations that broke up unloading, artillery concentrations mapped onto beaches at first light, and armed reconnaissance that hunted trucks forced onto bypasses and fords. The convoy model that had functioned in November, enter, discharge to pier or barges, clear before dawn, was now reduced to a sequence of short, hazardous landings on dispersed beaches that diluted cargo flow and exposed shore parties to observation. In response, Japanese planners shifted mass to two directions, small landing points north of Ormoc and the road west toward Palampong. Destroyers acting as fast transports continued to carry rifle companies, mortar sections, and signal teams, but escorts had to remain close to the beaches longer to control boat shuttles in rain and surf. Cargo vessels attempted to stage outside and sprint to the shoreline only when PT pickets were reported elsewhere. Where unloading succeeded, loads were pushed inland by hand and on improvised sledges to hides within marching distance of the highway. This dispersion preserved the ability to insert manpower, yet it degraded the ratio of heavy weapons to infantry and stretched the service troops responsible for ration, ammunition, and medical support. For U.S. commands, the shift confirmed that interdicting the coastline alone would not end the flow. Orders for November 11th to 14th December synchronized three actions: nightly destroyer entries keyed to forecast arrival windows, daytime air attacks on the northern beaches and on bridge approaches along the Palampong Road, and an accelerated ground advance to positions from which artillery could interdict the shoreline. Where weather briefly lifted, fighter-bomber cab ranks were stacked to strike sightings within minutes. Where ceilings closed, PT boats extended drift patrols in the approaches and attacked silhouettes at short range to scatter barges before they reached beach exits. The effect was cumulative. Convoy commanders were forced to choose between accepting damage inside the bay or attempting landings farther from the valley, which increased overland transit time and losses from road interdiction. The night of December 10th to 11th provided the inflection in practice. A Japanese echelon, covered by destroyers, attempted to enter under monsoon cloud. PT pickets reported bearing and speed. A U.S. destroyer group ran in at high speed and opened fire by radar solution against clustered targets near the waterfront, and moving contacts judged to be escorts. Torpedoes were exchanged at close ranges. Transports were set ablaze alongside, and barges broke away downwind. Though several hundred troops made shore at dispersed points, daylight reconnaissance on the 11th of December found wrecks, fuel slicks, and damaged barges across the southern coves. The escort screen was reduced, and the number of available Japanese destroyers for future convoy duty narrowed as damage and fuel consumption accumulated. The bay could still be reached, but it could not be worked with the rhythm required to maintain a counter-offensive force in the valley. By December 12th to 14th, the operational picture reflected that constraint. Japanese Army headquarters on Leyte reported that infantry replacements had arrived in company and battalion packets, yet mortar and artillery ammunition expenditure exceeded deliveries. Counterattacks were limited to platoon and company-strength thrusts at road nodes, supported by carefully rationed fire missions. Transport aircraft could not compensate for maritime shortfalls. weather and runway conditions restricted sorties, and cargo volume-to-weight ratios favored high-value items rather than bulk ammunition. On the U.S. side, the Albuera Lodgment supplied the northward push along the coast, but daylight ship losses to crash attacks continued to force caution in scheduling. Even so, artillery observers now plotted fire on the northern beaches and on the Palampon Road's choke points, turning every successful night landing into a race against first light. The decisive compression came on December 15th, when two developments converged. Offshore, a U.S. destroyer force intercepted another reinforcement attempt, approaching the bay, engaging at night and breaking up the formation with gunnery and torpedoes before it could establish a sustained unloading cycle. Ashore, ground units moved to positions that controlled the waterfront more continuously, simplifying observation and shortening artillery reaction times. The exact tally varied by report: transports sunk or disabled, escorts damaged, barges destroyed. But the operational consequence was clear. Convoy commanders could not assemble in the approaches with enough holes in time to deliver both personnel and the heavy cargo needed to restore offensive capacity. Japanese staff responses directed greater reliance on the Palampon axis, but the road west of Ormoc was now under repeated attack, and bridges collapsed faster than engineer units could replace them with timber trestles capable of supporting fully loaded trucks. Civilian patterns underscored the shift. In earlier weeks, requisitioned small craft and local labor had supplemented military unloading. By mid-December, waterfront fires, shelling, and airstrikes had cleared most of the port district, and villages near the northern coves emptied as residents moved inland. The reduction in available boatmen and carts constrained shore parties, who had to choose between keeping crews on the beaches longer, under observation, or abandoning cargo to avoid secondary explosions when air attacks found stacks. Reports from Filipino guerrilla networks in western Leyte described lighter traffic on the main coastal road and increased foot movement through bypaths after bridges fell. These observations matched aerial photographs showing fewer trucks in convoy and more dispersed movement by small groups under tree cover. Quantitatively, the turning point is expressed in rates rather than single-day totals. In November, Japanese echelons could put several thousand troops ashore in a week, with hundreds of tons of mixed cargo, albeit with significant losses. Between 10 and 15 December, the combination of a captured pier, continuous artillery observation, radar-directed night entries by destroyers, and daytime armed reconnaissance reduced sustained unloading windows to hours on scattered beaches and cut daily tonnage to levels that could not meet frontline expenditure. Japanese infantry strength on Leyte still measured in divisions by designation. Elements of the 1st and 26th Divisions, the 68th Independent Mixed Brigade, but their artillery density, vehicle availability, and radio battery stocks declined relative to November. U.S. losses, destroyers damaged or sunk, auxiliary gunboats lost, aircraft written off, remained real, yet the presence of functioning airfields, shore supply points, and intact road-building capacity allowed replacement and repair cycles that Japanese forces in the valley could not match. Command decisions. After December 15th reflected acceptance of this balance. Japanese orders prioritized holding actions on the northern approaches and along the Palampon corridor, with artillery fire rationed to counterattack windows, and with continued attempts to land small echelons at night north of Ormoc. U.S. orders emphasized pressure toward Palampon by converging columns, continued destroyer penetrations against any reported landings, and air interdiction of remaining bridges and ferries. The aim was no longer to close a single port, but to render an entire shoreline unusable for the volume of cargo required to sustain organized resistance in the valley. In strategic terms, the turning point at Ormoc did not end fighting on Leyte. Contact would continue for weeks, but it ended the possibility that reinforcement by sea could reverse the ground situation. After the 15th of December, Japanese staffs faced a distribution problem with fewer ships, fewer escorts, and longer overland routes under observation. U.S. staffs, despite ship losses to continued crash attacks, could now plan on ground advances supported by artillery, whose magazines were replenished from nearby beaches and by air sorties launched from the island itself. The momentum shift was not a single blow. It was the cumulative effect of intertwined constraints. From this point, the remaining question was how quickly converging ground forces could reach and cut the western exits at Palampon, and how thoroughly night surface action and daytime air attack could prevent any last-minute maritime evacuation or reinforcement along the northern shore. Combat operations in and around Ormoc Bay tapered as converging ground advances severed the northern beaches and the road to Palampon. After the seizure of Ormoc on December 10th, U.S. columns pressed north along the coastal road, while other formations from the eastern plain forced the passes to the west coast. By the third week of December, observation and artillery fire reached segments of the Palampon corridor. Barge routes once used for night landings now cross zones under intermittent air search and pre-planned concentrations. On the 25th of December, U.S. troops entered Palampon, cutting the western exit. Japanese units still holding positions north of Ormoc withdrew in packets toward interior hills, or attempted limited movement along secondary tracks toward the coast, but organized supply from the sea was no longer feasible. Night destroyer penetrations continued for several days to disrupt any residual unloading or evacuation attempts, and daytime armed reconnaissance suppressed new beach activity. Withdrawal for Japanese forces followed multiple paths shaped by terrain and remaining stocks. Formations with road access attempted to fall back by bounds to pre-selected lines covering junctions and creek crossings. Others, short of vehicles and fuel, moved by foot into hill massifs west and northwest of Ormoc to avoid encirclement. Rear guards laid mines and demolition charges at culverts, dropped trees across narrow defiles, and used small mortar teams to delay pursuit. When coastal retreats became untenable, small craft moved wounded and key personnel along short segments of shoreline at night to points farther north. But patrols and air search made sustained lift improbable. Company and battalion-level narratives describe ration cuts, reduced small arms scales, and the repurposing of animal transport for ammunition and medical evacuation. U.S. operations in the withdrawal phase prioritized two aims: sealing the coast to preclude reinforcement or organized escape, and compressing remaining pockets inland. Engineers repaired stretches of the coastal road to maintain pressure with artillery and to speed evacuation of wounded and civilians. Patrols moved quickly through abandoned waterfront zones to locate dumps, demolitions, and mines before port clearance began. Naval forces maintained night presence off likely landing points, with PT boats interdicting barge lanes and destroyers ready to engage escorts that approached within radar range. Air units shifted a portion of sorties to close support of infantry clearing operations and broken ground, while keeping armed reconnaissance over the northern beaches when weather allowed. Casualty reporting in this period reflected the campaign's attritional pattern. Japanese losses on Leyte included dead from engagements, air and artillery strikes on road nodes and beaches, disease and exposure in the hills. The number of prisoners remained comparatively low relative to the number of troops committed. U.S. losses accumulated from ground combat in close terrain, aircrew losses to weather and anti-aircraft fire, and naval personnel killed or wounded during earlier crash attacks and night actions in confined waters. Civilian casualties rose from bombardments near the waterfront and from fires that spread through adjoining districts, as well as from shortages once inter-island traffic collapsed. In the withdrawal phase, medical detachments on both sides reported increased cases of malaria, dysentery, and respiratory infections, a trend consistent with sustained operations in monsoon conditions. Logistics after the cutoff showed divergent trajectories. Japanese depots near the coast were either destroyed during withdrawal or abandoned under pressure. Ammunition for heavy weapons became scarce. Remaining stocks were held for local counterattacks that might open gaps for small unit exfiltration rather than for prolonged positional fire. Food supply depended on local requisition and foraging, reducing mobility and tying units to areas where rice or root crops could be obtained. On the U.S. side, supply lines shortened as the coastal road reopened in sections behind the advance. Beach operations near Albuera and, later, in Ormoc itself, moved from combat offloading under fire to organized reception, with priorities shifting to engineer stores, medical supplies, and construction material for bridging and port clearance. The humanitarian situation around the bay altered as front lines moved past the town. Residents who had fled inland began to return in small groups to assess damage, retrieve belongings, or rebuild shelters. Mines, booby traps, and unexploded ordnance complicated this return. U.S. engineer and ordnance units marked hazard areas, cleared piers and adjacent streets, and established controlled zones for debris removal. Water sources contaminated by wreckage and fuel, spills near the waterfront required temporary closures and the siting of purification points. Relief functions relied on local authorities where present and on military assistance where administrative structures had collapsed. Reports from Filipino guerrilla organizations indicated continued assistance in guiding patrols around mined fields and in identifying caches and isolated groups unaware that the coast had been sealed. Naval aftermath tasks were extensive. Survey parties charted wrecks in the bay and along approaches, marking hazards to navigation created by sunken transports, barges, and destroyed piers. Salvage operations prioritized clearing channels for small craft and ensuring that fires in holds carrying ammunition did not reignite. Minesweeping units extended their work beyond the main entrance to include coves used during the dispersed landing phase. The remains of scuttled or burned ships served for a time as markers of former berths and barge lanes. Their removal proceeded slowly, paced by available equipment and the need to address ordnance risks before cutting operations. The close of organized fighting on the West Coast did not immediately end small engagements. Japanese detachments in the hills launched occasional night raids against road crews and outposts, seeking to slow restoration of traffic and to cover movement deeper into the interior. These actions declined as ammunition and food shortages intensified. U.S. units responded with patrol sweeps, road security detachments at bridgeheads and bends, and artillery concentrations called in by forward observers positioned on ridgelines. The focus of large unit operations shifted toward linking with forces advancing from the north and east, and toward stabilizing the coastal belt for subsequent use as a logistics base within the archipelago. Command narratives after the closure of the bay emphasized different points. Japanese headquarters reported that reinforcement objectives had been pursued to the limits of available ships and fuel, and that units on Leyte would continue to resist from inland positions. Orders stressed conservation of heavy weapons and the reorganization of remnants into composite battalions. U.S. communiques identified the capture of Ormoc and Palampon and the interdiction of the shoreline as milestones enabling the declaration of Leyte secure by the end of December, while acknowledging continuing mopping up operations in interior terrain. Each side's account was consistent with its remaining capacity. A transition from sea-sustained operations to isolated inland resistance on one side, and from interdiction and assault to clearance and consolidation on the other. Metrics of the withdrawal phase were practical rather than symbolic. For maritime forces, the count of nights without reported landings or successful evacuations indicated the degree of closure. For ground forces, the rate at which bridges reopened behind the front and the number of pockets reduced marked progress toward full control of the coast. For civilians, the availability of clean water, staple foods, and access routes back to farms and markets signaled the beginning of recovery. By the end of December, these measures pointed in different directions for different groups, but converged on a common fact. Ormoc Bay no longer functioned as a corridor for organized reinforcement, and its surrounding settlements began the long process of clearing battle debris while the war in the archipelago moved on to other islands. The legacy of the Ormoc Bay fighting is measured in logistics, doctrine, and memory rather than a single spectacular event. Strategically, the December closure of the bay confirmed that sea control near an active land campaign could be achieved without a continuous carrier presence when airfields ashore, destroyer divisions, and PT squadrons were coordinated against a narrow maritime corridor. The reduction of Japanese reinforcement through Ormoc meant that field formations on Leyte could not be rebuilt to divisional weight with artillery and vehicles. That outcome shaped the remainder of the Central Philippines campaign. The U.S. landing on Mindoro on the 15th of December, 1944, proceeded while Ormoc operations were still underway. and planning for the Luzon landings at Lingayen Gulf in January 1945 assumed that Leyte's west coast would no longer draw major Japanese naval sorties. The sequence illustrates a cause and effect chain in which interdiction at a single bay affected operational timing across the archipelago. For Japanese command, Ormoc Bay became a case study in the limits of reinforcement under hostile air and radar-directed surface pressure. Convoys moved substantial numbers of infantry, tens of thousands over several weeks, but the ratio of heavy weapons and transport to rifle strength steadily declined. Destroyers used as fast transports demonstrated that disciplined crews could land companies under fire. They could not, in the face of repeated night penetrations and daylight armed reconnaissance, deliver the artillery and motor transport required for counteroffensive action on an island with few all-weather roads. The employment of special attack aircraft during the period damaged and sank U.S. ships and required tactical adjustments in picket lines and air cover schedules, yet it did not reopen the Ormoc corridor. Post-war analyses in Japanese naval and army studies highlighted fuel scarcity, the fragmentation of escort forces after October fleet losses, and the cumulative effect of radar and air-ground integration as decisive constraints. Operational lessons for U.S. forces derived from the same sequence. Night destroyer actions inside restricted waters validated training in radar plotting, fire discipline, and torpedo employment, but also documented the costs when surface groups operated under shore battery arcs and threat of low-altitude attacks at dawn. The interdependence of air and surface interdiction was clear in daily logs. Aircraft broke up daytime approaches, forced night runs, and suppressed beaches. Destroyers and PT boats intercepted within the bay and inside the heads. Artillery exploited any foothold gained ashore to control the waterfront by observation. Engineers' rapid extension of Marsden-matted runways on Leyte enabled this cycle by cutting sortie times and raising rates despite monsoon weather. The campaign thus entered service schools as a model of joint targeting, with specific attention to bridge denial, pier interdiction, and the scheduling of surface penetrations against forecast arrival windows. The civilian dimension left a parallel legacy. Port districts in Ormoc and nearby coves suffered multiple cycles of fire and blast, with housing loss and the contamination of water sources around wreck sites. As front lines moved past the town in late December, reconstruction began under hazardous conditions. Mines and unexploded ordnance on streets and in buildings, damaged wharves, and the need to re-establish inter-island traffic for staples. Filipino guerrilla organizations that had reported barge movements during the campaign shifted to guiding engineer and ordnance teams and to reconstituting local administration. The arc from requisition and displacement to clearance and reopening of markets became part of local memory, intersecting but not identical with military narratives focused on the bay as an operational target system. Commemoration took different forms across participants. In the Philippines, municipal memorials and annual observances marked the Leyte campaign as a step toward national liberation, with specific references to Ormoc's destruction and recovery. U.S. Navy and Army unit histories record the dates of night actions, ship losses, and regimental advances, using deck logs and after-action reports to reconstruct movements inside the bay. Japanese regimental and divisional histories emphasize night landings, marches from dispersed beaches, and the reorganization of remnant battalions under ammunition rationing, often naming officers and company grade leaders lost in December. War cemeteries and plaques at ports, airfields, and road junctions distribute remembrance across the same geography that governed operations. Historical debate concentrates on three issues. The first is timing, whether the decision to sustain TA convoys into December extended resistance on Leyte sufficiently to influence the tempo of U.S. operations elsewhere, or whether shipping and trained crews would have had greater marginal effect if conserved for later defense of Luzon and the southern archipelago. The second is attribution inside the joint system. Analysts differ on the relative weight of night destroyer penetrations, daytime air attack, and artillery observation from positions ashore enclosing the bay. The third is counterfactuals of amphibious maneuver. Some studies argue that earlier or larger West Coast landings might have shortened the campaign by severing the road to Palampon sooner. Others note constraints in shipping, weather, and crash attack risk that made the December schedule a practical limit. Quantitative anchors shape these discussions. Convoys in early November could put several thousand troops and hundreds of tons of cargo ashore in a week despite losses. By mid-December, sustained daily tonnage at Ormoc and adjacent coves fell below frontline expenditure rates in small arms and mortar ammunition. Destroyer availability on the Japanese side declined as battle damage and fuel consumption increased. U.S. destroyer and auxiliary losses from crash attacks and night actions forced rotations but did not halt penetrations. Bridges dropped on the Palampon Road faster than engineer units could replace them with trestles capable of bearing fully loaded trucks. These measurable constraints explain why the campaign's end state, U.S. control of Ormoc on December 10th and of Palampon on December 25th, followed by inland clearance, emerged when it did. In wider context, Ormoc Bay sits between two strategic pivots of late 1944, the attrition of the combined fleet and air groups during and after the Marianas and Leyte Gulf, and the restoration of a land-based Allied logistics network across the central Philippines. The bay's closure did not, by itself, determine victory in the archipelago. It did remove the last practical route by which major Japanese formations on Leyte could be rebuilt into an offensive force. It also demonstrated that once airfields were established on an island, coordinated interdiction could render nearby coastal waters unusable for organized reinforcement, even under cover of monsoon and darkness. The material traces of the fighting persist. Wrecks in and near the bay mark channels once used by convoys and sweeps. Survey and salvage records map where ships settled and where cargo burned or was jettisoned. Road alignments around former bridge sites reflect wartime demolitions and post-war repairs. Museum exhibits and archives in multiple countries preserve logs, photographs, and personal accounts that link individual experience to the operational map. Through these records, Ormoc Bay remains a study in the interaction of geography, logistics, and combined arms, at the scale where nightly decisions about convoys, runway matting, bridge fuses, and approach bearings translated into a theater's strategic calendar.